I was watching the NBA playoffs earlier this year on TNT, and they were advertising for their new show called The Lazarus Project. I'm always down to watch a good time travel show, so I decided to check it out. At first, it seemed like the show was just a somewhat unique premise and nothing really more than that. As I kept watching the show though, I discovered I was wrong. And as more episodes came out, I started looking forward to each Sunday for the next episode. But for some reason, I never really saw anyone talking about the show. I asked some friends about the show and they had never heard about it. Unfortunately, I believe that the Lazarus Project being on TNT has hurt its popularity, and I think this show is now a bit of a hidden gem, because the actual reviews for the show are great. So why don't we go over the events of the first episode to see if the show piques your interest. The show follows George, and at the beginning everything seems to be going well for him. He gets a startup loan for his new app, his girlfriend Sarah becomes pregnant, and eventually he marries her. Everything seems to be going his way, and then a deadly pandemic starts. Things slowly get worse until George and a pregnant Sarah go to an overcrowded hospital wondering if they're even going to survive. When suddenly George wakes back up on the first day of the show again. George is seemingly the only one that is experiencing all this for a second time, and this time things don't go well. His loan is denied, Sarah doesn't want to take a pregnancy test and thinks he's weird for even suggesting it, and after George goes full doomsday prepper for the coming pandemic, Sarah leaves him. His life turns into a disaster, but a small glimmer of hope is given to him when a strange woman named Archie seems to know about him reliving these events for a second time, and gives him an address for when the next cycle starts. Things then somehow get even worse, as George sees Sarah at dinner with a coworker Carl, who seemed to always have a crush on Sarah. Eventually, after a few miserable months, George once again wakes up on the first day. He immediately goes to the address Archie gave him and sees her again. She explains that she's a part of this secret organization called the Lazarus Project, whose goal is to prevent mass extinction events, and they use time travel to do it. But not in the way you might think. The way that time travel works in this show is that there's a checkpoint, and if something catastrophic happens like a pandemic or a nuclear explosion, then the Lazarus Project resets back to that checkpoint, which is always July 1st of each year. The majority of the organization is hand-picked members of different countries' elite forces. Once selected, members are given a chemical that allows them to remember the time jumps. However, one member is a mutant, someone who naturally has this ability to perceive these time jumps, and George has also just recently mutated to have the same ability. Because of this incredibly rare gift, George is offered to join the Lazarus Project, which he accepts. George goes to meet the rest of the team who are discussing the vaccine for the pandemic, but there's no time to rest for them because a nuclear warhead is missing. You know how easy those things are to lose. We then get a classic montage to turn George from app developer to super agent. By the end of this montage, George has adjusted so well to his new life that he even gets a lead. It turns out that a former Lazarus Project member named Rebrov is connected to the missing nuke, and both are in Paris. At this point, we are exactly 1 year from the start of the show, and so a new checkpoint has passed. Shortly after, George and some other team members fly to Paris for George's first mission, and he's having the time of his life at first. But things quickly get very real as Archie and another member of the team, the Dane, both die. Eventually, Rebrov is cornered and he sets off the nuke in Paris, which causes the Lazarus Project to reset back to the checkpoint. Right after the reset, the Lazarus Project contacts the French Special Forces to raid Rebrov as soon as possible, and they end up capturing him. There is one issue though. Remember Carl, the coworker that Sarah started dating after George went crazy prepping for a pandemic that hadn't started yet? Well, George knows that Carl got Sarah to break up with him and started dating her. So to get back at Carl for something he technically hasn't done, George purposely gives Carl bad financial advice. This silly little prank ends up making Carl lose a lot of his money. And so on the morning of July 1st, Carl gets angry at Sarah about this and ends up pushing her in the street. The first time this happened, George ended up saving Sarah, but after Rebrov blows up the nuke and the timeline is reset, George is distracted by a phone call from Archie telling him about the French Special Forces raid. And this time without George to save her, Sarah is hit by a truck, which she eventually dies from. And all of a sudden we have this great moral dilemma. Because these events take place on the morning of July 1st, if a mass extinction event takes place, then the Lazarus Project would reset back to the checkpoint and Sarah would still be alive. But this is what the Lazarus Project is working to avoid. So how far will a devastated George go to get back the love of his life? Once the show reached this point, I was really curious what other people thought of the show. So I jumped on Twitter, and when I couldn't really find anything, that's when it became clear that not that many people were watching the show. We can see that after a solid turnout for episode 1, there was a huge decline for episode 2. Unfortunately, I think that most people checked out after the needed setup and didn't really give the show a chance. Which is too bad, because I think the show has everything you would want. A unique premise, good acting, great soundtrack, and the show doesn't exactly go where you think it would. At least I know I couldn't accurately predict how it would turn out. I really think that this show is a hidden gem that most people haven't discovered. It's only 8 episodes and has already been renewed for a second season, so if you get hooked on the show, you don't need to worry about not knowing how the story continues. So if you're one of the people that either didn't continue watching the show or never saw it in the first place, I would strongly recommend giving the show a shot. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to like and subscribe. Also, I could use your help. I'm always on the lookout for more awesome shows, so comment down below your favorite hidden gem. Here's another video that I picked out just for you, and I'll see you in the next one.